What's up, everyone? It's your host, Maps, and you're tuning into the Way Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Adam Morris, right? That's your last name?
Yes, Morris.
And he is the president of the College Republicans. Adam, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you again, Javier, for inviting me. Like you said, my name is Adam Morris. I'm a sophomore in Keough Hall, double majoring in history and philosophy, and I am the president of the Notre Dame College Republicans this year, so I'm really excited to be on the show and just to talk about politics with Javier.
Yeah, thank you, bro. I'm excited, too. Can you bring the mic a little bit closer to you?
Sure thing.
It's all good. All right. So, essentially, I feel like this episode was, important to have because I do think that this is, a very interesting election year, kind of different than most years. I feel like there's a lot of questions in the air for a lot of people. I feel like there is definitely concern on both sides. So I just felt like it was fitting to kind of have it. Also, it's an election year, so kind of, it fits into the environment, if you will. So let's just jump right into it. I feel like we should start off with just addressing the big elephant in the room, which is just that I guess Donald Trump is an interesting person, I feel like, to have for as your candidate. How do you feel about President Donald Trump, and what's your perspective on him?
No, that's certainly an important question. I think, as someone who myself is very conservative, I see him kind of as a mixed bag in terms of policy issues. So if you just to go down the line for immigration, for example, in the summer of 2019, we had a surge of immigration across the border where we'd had hundreds of thousands of people crossing in the span of a few months. And I think he dealt with that pretty well in terms of sort of getting stronger enforcement. But overall, on the flip side of that, you look at the first term as a whole and the enforcement activity, the number of removals of illegal aliens is actually lower than it was in the first 4 years of the Obama administration, which might surprise some people, but it's kind of shows you there's both ends. And another issue, for example, that's important to me would be crime and criminal justice. So the Trump administration's Department of Justice has certainly had some good strategies in terms of combating violent crime. For example, prosecutions of felons in possession of firearms, or people who use firearms in furtherance of drug trafficking or violent crimes have increased, about 40%, under Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr. And that's what actually worked to sort of reverse the trend of increasing violent crime that we saw during the Obama administration. And on the flip side of that, he also signed sort of a pretty liberal criminal justice reform package that I wasn't a big fan of, but it managed to get its way through the House, the Senate, and the presidency, despite the fact they were all controlled by Republicans. So that's another issue where you see kind of both sides of it. On the courts, I think that's an issue that's very important for conservatives, especially sort of evangelical Christians. They care a lot about the kind of judges you have, and I think President Trump has largely delivered in terms of appointing judges who follow the meaning of the Constitution more closely and are guided by sort of applying the law instead of the making of the law. So that's been a positive. On the flip side of that, you see, for example, Justice Gorsuch. He wrote an opinion over the summer, the Bostock case, where he basically codified transgenderism into civil rights law, and despite the fact that's clearly sort of outside the scope of the law as it was written. So on all these issues, you see the pluses and the minuses from a conservative side. So I think it's important for conservatives to be intellectually honest, and when they're judging their candidates, you don't want to be this kind of guy who says everything Trump does is great and kind of just excuse even if he does something bad. And on the flip side, I don't like these people who are also never Trump, where they'll fail to acknowledge any gains Trump has made for conservatives. Even if they are themselves a conservative for whatever reason, they'll just have such a deep animus that they won't take yes for an answer ever. And I think it's always important to find a middle ground, to be intellectually honest about this is what I believe, this is where I align with President Trump, this is where I disagree with him, and let's see how we can work together, make compromises and accomplish as much as we can.
Right. Yeah. So do you think he's a good president?
I'd say, I'd say above average, almost good. If I were to give him a grade, I would give him a B-.
Okay.
Which, I'd say in terms of Republicans, I would say above average in terms of the average Republican in the GOP today.
Okay. Here's a good one, and I feel like this is kind of a question that I have, I thought about a lot, is do you think that Donald Trump is a good representative for the Republican Party?
Good representative in terms of messaging, or in terms of do his policies reflect what would
I guess
be Republican?
Generally, do you think he's just good to have as a representative of your party?
I think in these times I think it's actually, this might surprise some people, but I think it is good to have this moment in our time, someone who's kind of unorthodox and, maybe outside of the box a little bit, because I think since Reagan, the Republican Party really has not had a sense of energy and a sense of sort of direction, a sense of mission, sort of that kind of spirit and sort of fighting back. I think conservatives often are often too passive. They kind of want to be kind of too genteel or too polite, and they're not afraid. They're kind of afraid to be militant. I think Trump has brought a certain energy into the Republican Party when it's channeled properly. It can have positive effects, and also, often, when it goes in the wrong direction, it can also be a distraction, and he might do something that's does not reflect well on the Republican Party.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how, like, that aspect of it. I do feel like Donald Trump, he can sometimes make like some I guess offensive or kind of absurd comments. Obviously, a lot of what he says isn't factually accurate. So how do you feel about that? I feel like maybe having a president, a Republican president, that's I guess kind of like a loose cannon on that end of things.
Well, I mean, it's of course can be annoying sometimes when he says something. You just maybe just let's just why was this necessary? Why did you say this? But do you have anything specific that you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. So for one, I mean, I think that in terms of so here's a few examples. It's there's a very famous I believe it was a press conference or a rally where he was saying that when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Do you, this type of comment, it's not particularly, it's definitely offensive, and it's not particularly, I guess it's not very presidential. And even if I feel there is definitely a conversation to be had about immigration policy, but I don't know if this is the way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean that comment it wasn't at a rally. I think it was actually at his when he announced his candidacy.
Right.
But, maybe I can check after. But yeah, no, I mean it wasn't phrased the best way in terms of what it's offensive. I wasn't too offended by that. I guess if someone was immigrating, would they be offended by that? Maybe, but obviously, I'm not a very politically correct person, so
right.
I mean, that kind of comment, obviously, it could have been phrased better. It could have been said more eloquently, but
right.
I mean, that specific comment didn't bother me too much. I mean, there are some things, that he's said that's kind of just off the cuff that maybe
right.
are too far. But
yeah.
I'd say, most people, I think, I don't have as negative view of his comments or his tweeting as most people do.
I see that. So, I mean, yeah, this sort, these comments, I mean, this was a particularly, I guess, offensive comment to, liberal people, but, I mean, I think it doubles on the right, Donald Trump's made comments on, John McCain. He, famously said that, he's a loser and that he likes people that weren't captured and that he wasn't a war hero.
Yeah, that was dumb. That was really
right.
stupid.
Yeah. So I feel kind of that it doubles, right? It's the same way that's kind of dumb and stupid. I feel the same way.
Yeah, I will add that whenever he makes a comment like that, normally he's not the one to make the first strike, which is normally he's punching back, and whether that's always a good thing or whether he does it in the right way, that's separate. But I would add that he's not the kind of person that seems to initiate conflicts on his own. I think John McCain, obviously that was really kind of a lot of animosity between them, and McCain was kind of spiteful to Trump as well. So when you see these kind of comments, it's always important not just to look at them in isolation, but in the broader context as well. But with that specific comment with McCain, that was simply uncalled for. That was that's not something you should say.
I feel like a lot of comments that President Trump makes are kind of uncalled for in that same sense. It just depends. It just some people on the left get offended by certain comments, some people on the right get offended by other comments. But I think that generally, I guess Donald Trump isn't the type of person that I would describe as presidential, and I think that as president of the United States of America, I feel like there's a connotation with that. And how do you feel about Trump kind of, I mean, as a president and him not being presidential? And do you feel like there is maybe some importance kind of addressing, in that sense, this, you said, you referred to this comment as dumb and stupid. I agree. Do you think that there's maybe some importance there in kind of like how you phrase things and terminology, or is it just like
Sure. I mean, ideally, you'd always want a president who,
right?
is a good public face and, acts well and speaks well for the country. So, obviously, if you would, say things better, I would obviously take that for an answer. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a few like more examples, but we can move on past this. I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of like Donald Trump's slogan. I feel like, again, a lot of points from Trump kind of come from like his choice of words, and just how he is as a person. It seems like he's kind of, like I mentioned before, like a bit of a loose cannon. Like I want to talk to you about like make America great again, for starters. I feel like this is very interesting, like slogan to use, and I think that like there is a, not to be cliche, but a lot of people do ask themselves, like I guess believe that America wasn't great for a lot of people. What do you think he means by saying, when he says like make America great again? What do you think? Like what period of time are we like going back to, if that even is what he's referring to?
Yeah, I think the way you phrase that kind of question, I think it implies that simply, if you compare today to the past, simply because there were things in the past that we obviously see as wrong, that America wasn't a great country, and I simply don't buy that. I think America was great from its inception, and obviously like we wouldn't tolerate slavery today, but at the time of the founding, that was sort of that was just a feature of life, and I think our ability to fight our way out of slavery and to develop equality under the law is an achievement to be proud of, and it's something you won't see in every country today. Which is why historically so many people have wanted to move to the United States, and obviously if you want to come here, obviously they believe it's a great country, so it's better. And so I think for them, they saw it as better here, their opportunity, than what they had, wherever they were coming from.
Right.
So I think, obviously there's no utopia, but I'd say America is a nation that we should be happy, we should be patriotic, we should be proud to be Americans.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, the notion that some people have that, America was never great, it's not something I buy.
Okay. I understand that. But you can see how some people wouldn't agree with that.
I mean, I understand their arguments. It's just not something I agree with.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's shift a little bit to kind of another one of like Donald Trump's slogans, which is like "built the wall." Do you feel like building the wall is kind of the most efficient way to solve immigration issues? Yeah, what's your take on it?
Well, I think no one specific thing can solve, can secure the border as a whole, but I think building the wall is one of the key features. I think to put it in other ways, I think it would be, you could say it's a necessary condition, which is like at least you have to have physical barriers. I mean, some people say, walls don't work, which is, it's not simply, that's something not true. If you talk to a border agent or, they'll tell you that, at the very least, having a barrier there impedes the flow of traffic. It redirects it to somewhere where there's no barrier, and that way it's sort of, their job as enforcement job is more manageable, right? Because they're not having to cover all this terrain. I mean, you have a 2,000-mile border along the south, and you have, let's say 16,000 border agents total, so let's say 4,000 agents covering that. So you have every mile maybe one or two, a few agents, and that's really difficult to cover. So having a physical barrier there is I think definitely a necessary condition. And in terms of its overall cost, it's say to go across the entire southern border, it's 15 to $20 billion in terms of completing the wall. So it's not something that's astronomically high, and I think the benefits of having it there are very, very good, because it's something permanent, right? It's presidencies might change. Some presidents might enforce the law less than others, but if you have a barrier there, that's sort of always has a baseline of sovereignty along the southern border.
Right, I understand that. Yeah, I feel like one of the things that I kind of tend to consider is also like, well, is it more so worth kind of using the money that would be used to build a wall to like fix something about the actual system itself? Like, what do you think about maybe like using like resources, especially like since it's so much money, instead of like building a wall, using it and putting that into actual like into the actual process and kind of like reforming, I guess, immigration and how much of a mess it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I disagree with the notion that it's really expensive. Obviously, 15, $20 billion, and that's in common language, that's a lot, but in terms of government spending, that's not really a whole lot. And, in terms of reforming, the primary issues with the immigration system, it's not a financial issue. It's just a structural and organizational problem. It's a policy problem, right? So, throwing, so much money, down a black hole of a poorly administrated system, if you're not going to enforce the law, and no amount of sort of money thrown at that is it's going to fix it. So in terms of enforcement, that's definitely an important side of it, but that's not so much money as it is a policy problem, right? So if a president has implements a policy of catch and release, and sort of just releases individuals who show up into the interior of the country, which is problems we've had into the past. That's not a financial issue. That's an administrative problem. That's a policy problem.
Right. What about like maybe putting that money into some aspects of it, like maybe detention centers, maybe making those a little bit more pleasant for like people that end up there, and I don't know. I just feel like maybe not for the system, like maybe for elements of the system.
I think detention centers are definitely important. I think what we saw over the summer when we had 3 or 4 consecutive months with over 100,000 people entering illegally. I mean, obviously that was simply the numbers simply was too much for the detention centers to hold. So in terms of capacity, I mean sometimes that was just the sheer volume overwhelmed that. So I think that's it does, but it doesn't have to be either or, right? I mean, there's a lot of different things that government funds. You don't necessarily have to say that either wall or detention centers. And in fact, protecting, sort of securing the southern border or securing national boundaries in general is one of the most important obligations of government. So I don't think we should be too sort of nitpicky in terms of like how much money we spend, especially since the kind of money we spend either on a wall or in detention centers pales in comparison to the overall government spending.
Right. Yeah. I guess I feel like maybe a wall seems like a bandage. A Band-Aid to the problem, as opposed to like actually addressing the like you mentioned, it's a policy issue, and maybe actually addressing like that issue first, as opposed to just saying, hey, we're just going to put a Band-Aid here and then deal with everything else later.
I wouldn't say it's just Band-Aid. I think my solution to securing the southern border is to secure the southern border. I mean, that might sound kind of repetitive, or what do you mean? But it's really kind of straightforward. If you I think it's important to define what your objective is, and if obviously there's some people who simply don't believe that it's important to stop illegal immigration, and so obviously those people, the wall is not good for them simply because they don't want that. But if your objective, is to prevent illegal entry, right? A wall goes right to the root cause of that. A wall, by definition, right, by its very nature, prevents illegal entry. So I would say it's not a bandage. I think it addresses one of the root causes. It's not a panacea, but I wouldn't say it's a bandage either.
Right. Would a part of like addressing illegal entry into the country be facilitating legal entry into the country for some people?
I mean, we do facilitate legal entry, but
I mean, I guess like what we're doing is clearly not enough since we have a crisis at the border. I guess that's my point. It's like we kind of have to do better, right?
Do better in what sense? Allow more people in?
Well, I mean, at least improve the process to where it's easier, and maybe you don't get let in, but you get let no faster, or maybe we can vet people better so that maybe some of the issues at the border, like some of the concerns that people have with people coming into the country, can decrease. Or maybe, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of saying that the root cause of illegal immigration is, problems with the legal system. I don't really think that's the case. As long as you allow illegal immigration, it's going to continue. But if you sort of have a secure border and enforce the law, naturally people are going to understand that they're not going to be able to get away with it, and the illegal immigration won't happen. And in terms of the numbers, so saying you're going to end illegal immigration by making illegal immigration faster, that's not going to happen because there's always going to be more people who want to come in than are going to get through the legal process, and you don't want to have infinite legal immigration either, because that's not good for the country, right? So you have to sort of have at some point you have to say this is going to be sort of where we draw the line. We're going to have this many people come in, and then we're also going to make sure to enforce our laws.
So you think? I guess I'm asking. Do you think that maybe we should not let in that many people?
I think if we secure our southern border and had basically an end to illegal immigration, I think the numbers we have legally would be pretty appropriate, right? I mean, if combined the two, I think it's overall too much, but we give out about 1 million green cards a year, which is a lot. And in terms of the percentage of the population that's foreign born, it's about as high as it's been. The only other year where it would be high would be like 1910, 1920. So in terms of that the notion that the U.S. it's very difficult to enter legally, I mean, I wouldn't say that's the case. So but I think if we had a secure border, I think I would be fine with keeping the numbers where we are at.
Right. Yeah. So in the debate, your college Dems versus college Republicans debate, which I gotta commend you guys. I feel like the college Republicans did really well in that.
Thank you.
Like you said that like nearly every mile along the southern border is controlled by like Mexican drug cartels. So like given that, like you can understand why there's like larger numbers of people coming in and how like some people's lives might depend on coming into the country.
No, I understand, generally why people want to come to the United States. I love being an American, and I'm sure that, the reasons why I like being American, that provides incentives for people to come into the country. So in terms of understanding why people want to immigrate here, of course I understand that. In terms of the what you mentioned specifically, the Mexican cartels, I don't think most people who are coming here actually live directly along the southern border. So the notion that because, they have, Mexican organized crime rings, basically control smuggling on the southern border, the notion that threatens, someone in Guatemala or Honduras isn't exactly the case. And in terms of like what we've seen recently, I'd say the past few years, especially after DACA, it's been primarily, Central American, like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. So they're making their way to the southern border, and that's where they interact with their cartels. But the notion that, the cartels are what's forcing them, and in some cases that is the case, but
yeah. I mean, Central America, yeah, they have their own I guess like crime lords and cartels and gangs, and I feel like Central America, and I feel like Latin America as a whole has definitely issues with like drugs and crime, which is why a lot of people immigrate from Central America as well.
They do, yeah. I'd say as the primary motivator for people coming here, I'd say it's probably just the overall better economic conditions and work opportunities. In terms of people from like the Northern Triangle, which would be like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they tend to come from rural areas. So at least that's according to like DHS statements that have been kind of recently made. So the notion that it's primarily crime that's driving them isn't exactly the case. And and for some reference, Baltimore has a higher homicide rate than I think either some of those countries or possibly all of them. I'm not sure, but definitely some of the Northern Triangle countries like Guatemala or Honduras. So and the fact that wouldn't you wouldn't say that's the fact that someone lives in Baltimore all of a sudden gives them sort of a right to entry into, let's say, Canada, right? So Canada of course has a right to its sovereignty and to secure its borders.
Right. So you mentioned DACA, and in the debate you said that you think there should be no consideration of any amnesty until we have a secure border. What do you think we should do with like DACA recipients and maybe people that have been here, for example? So I'm from Puerto Rico. I have friends here that go here to Notre Dame who are DACA recipients, and they have lived here in the States, on the continent for a lot longer than I have. Yet, I guess I would consider them even more American than I am. I'm fully American, so I guess what about those people who essentially are just more, in some cases, culturally more American than Americans than some American citizens? What should we do with what do you think about that?
Yeah, I stand by my position earlier. It's, to say that you don't want further amnesty is not to make a judgment on everyone here. It's primarily an understanding of what amnesty does, which is, if you offer amnesty to the people here already unlawfully without securing the border, that only, drives more illegal immigration, right? So we had an amnesty during the Reagan administration, and this was supposed to be, the kind of ends illegal immigration, fix this, this quote unquote immigration reform that's going to fix this problem that's been a perennial problem, at least for the past few decades in the U.S. of contention. But after we had the amnesty, now where are we now? We have, by the most conservative estimates, we have 11 million people here unlawfully. So because amnesty, if you don't have enforcement, simply encourages more people to come unlawfully because it provides incentives for that. So to say you don't want amnesty, it's not to say that the people here are all good or all bad. It's to say that it's a policy that undermines the national sovereignty, right? And yeah, in terms of what you brought up, in terms of saying your friends are more American than many Americans themselves, I'd say that's certainly true for a lot of immigrants, especially they often tend to be people who have a lot of gratitude for the United States and who are happy to be here and sort of have a perspective, comparing, let's say, their life in the U.S. to their home countries, and these are obviously the kind of people you want. And it's important to make the point that immigration can't be judged abstractly. This is a quote that the economist Thomas Sowell would often say. There's no such thing as abstract immigration, and what that means is that immigration can have a positive impact on a country and can have a negative impact, right? There's some people who are gonna just like people generally, there's no abstract person. There are people who are good people and there are people who are not good people. So and that applies to immigration as well. So again, the primary reason, like I reiterated, for not wanting a future amnesty, for the time being, is simply to say that not to make a judgment about the people who are here, but simply because the experience we've had with amnesty in the past have simply failed, right? I mean, they failed to accomplish the primary responsibility of the government, which is to secure the border. And so obviously, amnesty, is benefit some people, but securing the borders is also important. And if you weigh those two things, the government's primary responsibility would be to secure the border, right? And to a certain extent, those are mutually exclusive.
All right. Well, we spend a little bit of time on immigration. Let's move to another topic here. Let's talk about, I guess, racial injustice. In the debate, the college reps versus Dems debate, you referred to kind of the climate around racial injustice as like one that perpetuates a false and destructive narrative. What do you think? I guess, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd say the narrative, I'm referring to primarily the narrative being pushed by Black Lives Matters, the notion that law enforcement in America is systemically racist, or that the criminal justice system, the prison system, is systemically racist. So I'd say that's the narrative, and I can certainly, as we go on to the discussion, I can, obviously, explain why I believe what I do. So if you have any sort of questions specifically you would like to ask about that, go ahead.
I guess to me, and I feel like to a lot of people, it makes sense that like America was systemically racist not that long ago. So it makes sense that like a lot of those policies kind of carry over to right now, and that there is still like systemic racism in the country because I guess we had a greater level of it not that long ago. Like the civil rights movement was like less than 100 years ago, and that's effectively like yesterday. So it just makes sense that there would still be some crossover and still be some problems there.
I mean, perhaps it makes sense in an abstract, but if you're going to say there's policies carrying over from the past to present, you have to explain what those policies are. And in terms of, specifically regarding the criminal justice system, the central claim obviously is the one that, police are, killing sort of unarmed African Americans sort of vastly, disproportionately, or sort of targeting them, or that they're, that they're a threat to, blacks in their sort of everyday lives. And, that's simply not true if you look at the numbers. So yeah, I mean, you can say, perhaps there are some aspects of the criminal justice system that have carried over from the past to today, but I would like to hear what those are, because the examples put forward by the people pushing this narrative simply don't hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah, I guess it's more of a societal thing. I think that's one of the issues. It's like there is, like from the moment that since the country's inception, it's like the Black people's rights and and liberties have always been like I guess they haven't been granted like rights or liberties, and like the civil rights movement definitely helped in that. I just don't know if that was like the end of the line there. I don't think so, just because I think there's still like it's a societal thing. Like our country, since the moment it was created, it's like we had like slavery, and then even after that ended, like the issues weren't over. So I guess it's the same applies to the civil rights movement. It's just like just because we had that doesn't mean the issues are over. They're more so, I guess, societal, and I think it's important to consider those, and those reflect themselves in policy.
I mean, I agree with most of what you said in terms of, out of found we had a problem with, certainly with racism and into the civil rights era. But again, the central claim here of the BLM movement is that the police are systemically racist, or that, that the prison system is systemically racist or unjust. And again, if you're going to make those claims, you have to say, okay, well, this is why it is, right? So, simply saying that, we had a civil rights movement, or that we blacks weren't granted, equality under the law until then, that doesn't exactly, that's not an argument for saying what Black Lives Matter believes, right?
Right. I guess I'm talking more so, I guess Black Lives Matter is a big part of it. I'm just talking more so like in general. But even under the lens of Black Lives Matter, I do feel like people are just trying to achieve like equality and equity in the country and kind of establish that. Because I think it's definitely clear that there is an issue with Black people and people of color in the country and law enforcement. I mean, that's what we've seen a lot through like experiences. We have like videographic evidence of that even. And I think that like those experiences are definitely real, and they've, like, George Floyd kind of gave us a perfect example of that, and thank God that like somebody was there to record that, because I feel like that's kind of what unfortunately it took having a video of something like that to kind of spark, like put a spotlight on it.
Yeah, I mean, again, those obviously the experience that we saw on videos is certainly real, but again, you have to. You're kind of dancing around the claim, which is, what exactly is it about the police or the prison system that, makes it systemically racist, right? And, to give you, let's say, just to make another point, in Maryland, one of the counties in Maryland, there was a guy named Duncan Lemp, and he was, shot in his bedroom, as the police were conducting sort of a raid on his house, and he was shot from, the officers were, I think, outside the house, and they shot into his bedroom, and they killed him while he was in bed. And this is, a story that got basically no coverage, right? I mean, have you heard of it?
No.
If you ask someone who's George Floyd, everybody knows who George Floyd is. If you ask someone who's Duncan Lemp or who's Tony Temple, which is who was killed in a manner not too dissimilar to George Floyd, they would say they have no idea what those are. And and I'd say that, unfortunately, I mean, this might offend some people to say this, but the reason you don't know who they are is because they were white, and that their story simply did not get as much traction because it didn't sort of fit the narrative that was being pushed. And I would say that because Duncan Lemp was killed, it looks like, at least from the evidence we have so far, obviously the investigation has not been very thorough or transparent, which is another unfortunate aspect. But it looks like he was certainly killed unjustly from the evidence. But I don't take that experience. That experience is certainly real, and I grieve for the families of him, just like I grieve for George Floyd's family. But I don't use that to say that cops have some kind of bias against white Americans.
I think the main difference there is the fact that the history and also just the motive behind like the society, like racism has obviously played a massive role in the history of the country, and I think that it has it's still very real for a lot of people. So I mean, like I think the reason isn't I mean, race obviously does play a role in it, but I think that if police kill a white person as opposed to a black person, I think the motives there and the societal implications of that are completely different. Because we didn't.
What are the different implications? I mean, and to use some of the examples, for example, George Floyd specifically, is there, do you think the officer was motivated by race? Because I obviously, based on the footage we have, what he did certainly looks wrong and very wrong. But I haven't seen anything that would implicate that it was racially motivated. I mean, simply the fact that he was white and the officer was white and the victim was black does not make it racially motivated in the same sense that if the races were reversed, it would necessarily be racially motivated.
Right. I think it's just the fact that, like, I guess, do you think then that like there's just no correlation between that like history of racism and slavery in the United States and our systems today? Because I feel like there could, like, it makes perfect sense for the fact that like a lot of the first police departments to ever be established in the country had to do with like wrangling up slaves and searching for them across state lines, and I just feel like there's definitely a correlation between kind of like the historic aspect and and that reality of slavery and racism, and that wasn't like the civil rights movement. We see it as like being super far. It's like it was effectively yesterday. There was extreme racism at the time as well. Like we're not that far from that, so it just makes sense that there's like we're looking back now towards a period of time that was 70 years ago. Who's to say that 70 years? Like I feel like saying that 70 years from now we'll look back to now and say, yeah, it was all solved. Seems a little optimistic and unrealistic.
I mean, maybe we will, but again, if you're going to make a claim about an institution, you have to judge that institution by its, by how it acts today, right? For example, like take the obvious example of slavery. Obviously slavery does, existed in the past and it was a horrible thing and it doesn't exist today, right? So if you're going to judge the United States today on, for example, its record on slavery, you would say, very obviously slavery does not exist here, and the fact that it existed in the past, obviously does not mean it exists today. So obviously that's sort of a very, sort of a stark example, kind of like a very basic one. But again, if you're going to judge an institution, you have to judge it by its qualities today. Like for Notre Dame, for example, Notre Dame admits women today. I would say, is the university discriminating against women, or is there a bias against women? I'd say, no. And if you're going to claim that is, you have to judge Notre Dame by how it acts today, right? I wouldn't say that the fact that, at one point Notre Dame was not admitting women into its campus certainly does not mean that reflect how it behaves today, right? So, I mean, these constant references to the past, I think, some people, I definitely understand why where it's coming from, especially for people who have grandparents or great-grandparents who, lived through that, and, maybe their ancestors were slaves, and, maybe, their great-grandfather was someone who was not able to go to a bar because he was black. And I agree why some people might constantly appeal to the past to describe today's institutions. And I don't pretend like the institutions we have today have shed everything that was wrong with the past. But again, if you're going to judge an institution today, you have to judge it, how is it functioning today? And I would, if there's something specific about our criminal justice system, you want to talk about, I'm all here to do that, which is where the debate should be, right? It should be, how are we operating today, and where is it wrong, where is it right?
Right. Well, I disagree, because I think a big part of the debate is like, yeah, slavery is not around anymore, but racism still is, and that's kind of like where the root of slavery, or a big pinnacle of it was. It I guess, plunged the country into a civil war, and the civil rights movement, which wasn't that long ago. I feel like, racism is obviously still around today, so I just feel like that is like that social side, that historical side is just as relevant as your the direct policy side of things. It's like society, people are influenced by that history. We're still affected by it. It still exists today. It makes sense that it would be implemented in systems that were made by people during time. Many of them that were implemented by people during a time where, and even still today, like racism's still around. So it makes sense that like racism would still be attached to policy.
Oh yeah, racism is certainly still around, and I agree that past influences can, of course, can and do affect present systems, and but past influences can also be overcome. So I think we're kind of dancing around the question. So maybe I'll ask you directly: what specifically about our criminal justice system do you think is systemically biased or racist?
I think the fact that
is it the way sentencing is done? Is it the way incarceration is done? I mean, that's where you have to make the arguments.
Right. Well, that's my whole point. Is I think there's a larger argument to be had about racism, and it's not just about, hey, look at this policy. If we fix this policy, it'll fix everything. There's a systemic issue that is attached to this history and our society that in many ways. I mean, we can talk about.
You made a good point when you said past influences can influence your systems today, and of course,
yeah, but that's
true. So if you're going to say that the past legacy of slavery is influencing our justice system today, you should be able to point out, okay, this is obviously where the influence of racism can still be seen, which is why my question is perfectly valid. What specifically about our criminal justice system is the past past racism reflected?
I think that the fact that we've had all these stories, all these experiences. I think the fact that we have a president today that's made some, let's say, insensitive comments. In some instances, I would consider some of those comments racist. I've considered some of those comments, some of his actions very inconsiderate. And I do think that all of that ties into, I guess, my whole point is that I guess it's just a difference in, like, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you understand that you should point out specific policies, specific, like, pinpoint something in the system. I guess that's the whole point, is that my argument is that the system as a whole is under the influence of that history and the present right now. Like, racism isn't gone yet.
No, I agree, but but then if that's true, then my question to you that I mentioned earlier still stands, which is, where exactly am I seeing that influence in the criminal justice system? Or, in terms of, you brought up experiences. Experiences are important, but experiences don't define a system, right? So you have to look at things in totality. And to cite just one study, 2019, there was a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where researchers from Michigan State University did multi-nominal regression analysis on fairly comprehensive database of police shootings, and they came to the conclusion that they could not find evidence of anti-Black or anti-Hispanic disparities in police shootings or officer-involved shootings. And importantly, they also concluded that white officers were not more likely to kill minority civilians than Black officers. And in Chicago, a study examining 270 police shootings also found that officers who fired their weapons matched the demographics of the department, meaning, if you had, let's say, the department was 51% white, then the percentage of officers who fired their shootings was about that same percentage, right? So if you're going to make these kind of arguments, I want to make these arguments. I want to, address the concerns of people who, sort of agree with the narrative being pushed by BLM. I want to hear what they have to say, but again, if you're going to make these arguments, these are the terms you have to argue on, right? If you take the position that the past ill influences are still manifested today in these systems, and I would like to see, I would like to hear then what exactly is this influence seen? Right.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm just like repeating myself at this point, but I do think that, like, I guess that we believe that we, like, the terms on which we argue are different.
I agree with your. I think you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but your basic way you approach this argument is that there is racism has been part of our history, that things in the past can influence things today, so therefore it makes sense that racism would influence things today, and that's possible. But it's also possible that you overcome negative past influences. So again,
but I think the fact that racism still exists is objective. Like,
that's objective, right? But that's and I don't. We're not in disagreement with that. Where I do disagree with would be with the sort of the narrative pushed by Black Lives Matter that officers or the criminal justice system is systemically racist, right? I mean, saying racism exists and saying the narrative pushed by BLM are two separate things.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, let's talk a little bit about kind of defunding the police, and I guess it does make sense to me that if there is a police budget that is overblown and like we're like militarizing the police, it makes sense for me to take some of that budget and allocate it to like communities, and maybe even keep some of that money even in the police department itself. However, use it to train people better, use it to train like officers about like racial bias and how it kind of plays into the system, and how to better engage people in the community. What do you think about? Do you think that it would be good to maybe take some of the money from some of like police if a budget is overblown? Do you think there could be some sort of audit and then kind of reallocate some of those funds to communities?
I mean, if you have a budget that's overblown, certainly reallocation makes sense, but I disagree with that premise. So, according to the Urban Institute, I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but it was about 4 to 5% of state and local budgets are directed towards police departments. So, of course, if you look at local budgets specifically, it's a much higher percentage of their budgets are allocated towards police departments. So that's simply because police are largely managed on a local level, while the state will take over other functions. But if you look at state and local budgets combined, the funding for police would be, according to the Urban Institute, around like 4 or 5%, and you have a lot more money going to social services or other programs. So I mean, I agree. If I don't like, I'm a conservative guy. I don't like overblown budgets. But I just disagree with the premise that police budgets are overblown. In terms of allocating resources to the community, policing is one of the most important functions that can be performed in a community. To give you some examples of how this can impact communities, take, for example, New York City, where in this past June, arrests were down 54%, and we saw a doubling in shooting victims from, June 2020 compared to June 2019, right? And, here's the kicker. 97% of the victims of shooting were minorities, right? 97, that means they were either black or Hispanic. So, the reductions in police activity really were destructive towards especially minority communities who are vastly disproportionately affected by violent crime. So is policing an important investment? It is. And I think to a certain extent, having an orderly society, having safe streets is a precondition to human flourishing, right? So you can't have, let's say, a booming economy. You can't have really high quality school systems. You can't have people having businesses and jobs if your streets aren't safe, because then people are not going to want to be there. And we saw that in Minneapolis, where after some of the anarchy that took place, there was a business that simply announced a pretty prominent manufacturing plant that announced we're going to leave because the government is not doing its most basic obligation to the community, its most basic community service of sort of keeping an orderly society, and our business simply cannot function in these conditions.
Right. Let me just ask you really quick. Do you have to leave at the hour, or can you stay a little?
Oh no, I can stay for as long as you want.
No, because I just have.
This is a great conversation.
Oh yeah, I just have a lot of points, and I just didn't know if I had to I guess cut to some of them that I think are more important. But it's cool. I can stay too, of course. Yeah.
You have any thoughts on what I said, or?
Yeah, I do think. I do think policing is important, objectively. I think, I met with, I had him on the show, Morja Robertson, and he leads a radio show called Black ND, kind of showcasing perspectives of black students, and he also agreed that policing is important. I think that I do think though that maybe some resources that go into certain areas of policing should be reallocated. Maybe even within the same departments. I guess I do think racial bias training is important. I do think it's totally possible for a racist person to apply to become a police officer, and there's bound to be racist police officers out there. But I think if we can circumvent that and I guess vet those people and help them understand how to engage people in certain communities and across different cultures as well, I think that's incredibly important too.
Yeah, no, I don't think I disagree with most of what you said. I agree with that. Is maintaining the quality of police departments and maintaining as high standards for police-civilian interactions as can be done is important, right? And I think those things should certainly be funded. I think but that's obviously has to be done on a sort of case-by-case basis, right? You can't. Like I mentioned earlier, I disagree with the premise that police budgets as a whole are overblown, and in terms of specific cases, you have to look at a city and say, okay, you have to look at that specific city and say, okay, where could we use more resources, right? So, and that's really a judgment that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But of course, always trying to improve the standards of interactions with civilians, always trying to improve, the way police approach their jobs is important. And, I think that means that's part of that is funding those things within police departments, right? So that's obviously contrary to defunding the police. That would fund the police.
Yeah, I do think that there is definitely a technicality with defunding the police. I don't think, because I feel like the same way that I don't know, some other, for example, Make America Great Again is I guess, you explain how it's, it has, it's valid, and it has, it's meant to be interpreted in a certain type of way. I feel like defund the police is also meant to be interpreted in a certain type of way. I think.
I'm not sure about. I think most people who use that slogan, defund the police, want significant reductions in police activity, right? So whether it's a complete defunding or partial defunding, I think all of them are guided by the premise that either there's too many police on the streets, that police are too active, that they make too many arrests, and that we need to reduce police activity substantially. And I think that's something I disagree with. So Obviously, when they say that, if someone means, we want to sort of reallocate resources to this particular aspect of police training, I agree with them. But then I would ask those people, obviously those kind of people are not the ones who would be saying defund the police.
Well, I think that some people might be, because I think that you could definitely reallocate resources to maybe not within a police budget, but maybe to a community to reduce the amount of crimes, or to reduce, or maybe like if a certain type of, if like, for example, dealing with people that are suffer from mental illnesses, and there's been instances in where police show up to a scene where there's a person that's mentally ill, and we have a tragedy, and that person is shot because of the way the situation was handled. I think they're definitely. I think there should definitely be a diverse set of responses to issues and emergencies in society. It shouldn't just be like, hey, call the cops. That's like the end all be all. Or if the police is the end all be all, then they should be trained to handle all those instances. And I think that maybe like that's where like the problem is, because I don't think they are trained to.
Yes, you mentioned moving money to reduce programs that reduce crime, and I'd say policing is one of the most important things to do that. So why necessarily it has to come out of the policing budget? I'm not sure. I wouldn't say it does have to come out of that. And again, what was I going to say? You mentioned the sort of different community service act sort of members, or social workers, response teams, and those are all important. Again, I'm not sure why that necessarily has to come out of a police budget, and I will say it's definitely important to have people that are trained to involve themselves in those situations. But having law enforcement there is also important as well, because things that are non-violent to begin with can often escalate into violence, right? So that's why having people who are prepared to use force is important.
I do think that I think it's a tricky slope. I think that again, policing is important, but I do think that allocating those funds could be equally just as important.
I think I think our part of the reason we might be having kind of difficulty with this is we're arguing in kind of an abstract sense, and if you want to make policy, it has to be done in the specifics, right? So you have to look at a police department here and say, are these police funded too much, or do we need more money in that specific program? So I think you can't really have debates about sort of a vast array of different police departments in a very abstract sense.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's fair to some degree. Here I have another topic I want to get to. Let's talk about climate change a little bit. And obviously, I guess President Trump isn't particularly too much of a believer in it. How do you feel like? I mean, I'm personally of the belief that climate change is extremely important. Like being from Puerto Rico, we've suffered from many like natural disasters as a result of climate change. Right now, for us, we've had earthquakes, hurricanes, tropical storms. But I mean, you look at America in general. We've had an earthquake not too long ago in Louisiana. Believe it was Hurricane Delta. We have the California's on fire, and like President Trump's response to, for example, the California wildfires was to get like forest patrol and clean up trees. I don't think that's the right response. I do think that we should act more so on maybe our commitments to, keep our carbon emissions down. How do you feel about climate change and, I guess, Trump's response to it?
Sure, I'd like to address a few points that you made. So you said like Puerto Rico, for example, has hurricanes as a result of climate change, and the way you phrase that, that's obviously, I think I get what you mean. The way you phrase that, in a sort of literal sense, is simply not true. The hurricane is not the result of climate change, although climate change can influence and impact natural disasters. It could make them definitely more severe, but the notion that people go around and attributing any specific disaster, and their first thing to say is climate change, I think that can be misleading. Although, I do get where they're coming from. In terms of the forest patrol, if you want to deal with a wildfire in its immediate sense, I think that's probably one of the most important things you could do, right? Because, wildfires, it's an event that takes place, it's happening now, and you want to deal with it response. You want to have a response that's directly addressing it in a very immediate and specific way. So I wouldn't say that's a bad response. Now, in terms of the longer term, which is I think where we probably where you were looking at, like in terms of reducing overall emissions, I think that's certainly important. And the U.S. has done that. I think since 2007, 2008, emissions have been down, 15% plus, and then I think recent years they've been being reduced even more, and that's largely thanks to development of natural gas. I think natural gas is the number one reason the United States has reduced its carbon emissions, and then behind that, you also have the development of renewable energy sources, and I'm for the development of all of those things. And then, yeah, I mean, do you have any?
I think there is a correlation with like natural disasters and climate change. I understand your point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we agree. I think the way you just said it initially, that it's a result of climate change. You can't point to a natural disaster and say climate change causes, but it is definitely fair to say that there's correlations in
right, especially
that's fair.
In severity as well.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, I do think that. I guess, how do you feel about like our president not particularly believing in climate change?
Do you have like a specific statement?
No, but like for example, he mentioned that when they were talking in the most recent press conference, I don't have like a soundbite or anything, but he said that science. They asked him a question about the California wildfires, I believe it was, and he said like, "Oh, science doesn't know." I think he's definitely been dismissive of climate change. I think that's a fair statement to make.
Yeah, in terms of that specific statement, the statement that science doesn't know. I mean, depending on how you interpret it, if he's saying that science doesn't know whether climate change can influence these things, that would be false. But to say what the influence is and how much, that's certainly more open, right? So I guess, yeah, I mean that specific comment, if what he means by that is that it's climate change is not real, then I certainly disagree with him. So I guess
yeah. I guess I think that's kind of an optimistic view of it, but I agree. I think I just don't think he's like he addresses climate change to the degree that he should. I mean, I'll give you or natural disasters with the respect that he should. I mean, like I'll give you an example. When he came to Puerto Rico, he like threw paper towels at people, and that's like it's just very disrespectful. It's not the appropriate response when you have like over nearly 3,000 people died, and he was also trying to undermine those numbers. So I just think I don't think he takes it I definitely don't think he takes it as seriously as he should. And I would even venture to say that he's, disrespectful in his response towards natural disasters.
Yeah. So in terms of the Puerto Rico instance specifically, I didn't know he threw toilet paper, and if depending on the context, that's probably a bad thing that he did. I mean, but that's not the response to the whole problem. Specifically. So, I think if you want to get into this more specifically, it certainly it was claimed that, the way he addressed hurricane in Puerto Rico was not good, that he wasn't, trying to stall resources or whatever. But, part of the problem was, there were resources there, that were sent by the federal government in different warehouses, and the problem was a distribution problem, right? So part of it was simply, just the logistics, like they were at first relying on sort of local officials to try to distribute the different resources that were sent to Puerto Rico, and that wasn't working out in part because, official, but also just logistics, like, after Puerto Rico after a hurricane, it's difficult to get those things around. And, eventually what he did was he sent, it was either military or National Guard to directly distribute those resources, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't say that was necessarily a bad response. I think that was how you normally would approach things, which is, you first, the federal government sort of does the backing, and then it's implemented, and then if local officials need help, then of course the government should step in.
Right. Sorry for being on my phone, by the way. I'm just like, I was supposed to hand off to something to a friend after this episode, and it's going to be longer than I plan it to be. I also want to take this time to say that if anyone's listening on the WVFI broadcast on Thursday, this episode is going to be like longer than, like, we're just going to continue having conversation. We're going to go over the hour, so just hop on over to the YouTube page or the Instagram page to catch the rest of the conversation. But I just want to throw that out there so people can know where to get that. Yeah, I understand your points. I disagree. Puerto Rico was a disaster, to say the least.
The impact there was certainly bad, right?
Right, but just in terms of like logistics. Like I have a hard time believing that the greatest country in the world can't gather the logistics of an island that's like 100 by 35 miles. It's tiny. They could definitely do that. And in terms of distribution, it just didn't happen. I think that there's definitely a conversation to be made about like the local government and them doing a poor job as well. But I think the federal government also didn't deliver enough aid either. So let's kind of move past this a little bit. How do you think we should handle like corporations and how kind of like they handle their emissions? Do you think we should hold them to a certain standard? Should it be like a free for all? I guess like what's your take on it? I do think that we should. I mean, like I do know that like certain corporations are kind of looking into like limiting their carbon emissions, but obviously like they're large contributors of carbon emissions as a whole. So what do you think we should do in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of applying, I think in the abstract it makes sense that you would have some level of environmental standards, and we do, and I think, for a variety of different environmental issues in terms of different kinds of pollutants and what can be emitted and what cannot, and, obviously the laws on the book have to be enforced, and, if there's, as they are. Now, in terms of, what a cap on carbon emissions would look like, maybe could you say what you were thinking, right? Because different corporations, depending on their size or what they do, will have different, levels of emissions, and having, how to manage that is, I think,
right.
Pretty tricky.
I understand. Yeah, let's talk about China for a little bit in terms of their emissions as well. I do think that I think that China is definitely a big problem when it comes to emissions. I think it's hard to hold China accountable for a lot of the things they do. It's, on their list of bad things that the Chinese government is doing, maybe climate change is probably at the bottom or near the bottom. They obviously have lots of human rights offenses as well as, just mess. How, I guess, is it important maybe to act as a leader in the world for the United States to be kind of like, a representative of what just represent what countries should be like? Should we? Because I feel like oftentimes an argument I hear a lot is like, well, like we look at China, like they're doing a lot of, like they're doing their emissions like are off the charts, like it's what we're doing is fine. But I think that as the leaders of the free world, if you will, like we should kind of like set some example. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, setting example is important. I think to a certain extent we do. I mean, we've certainly had made tremendous progress in the past few decades in terms of like cleaner air overall, but also in terms of emissions specifically, right? And how much China is going to follow the lead, of Western countries in generally have been improving in that regard. So how much China is going to follow Western countries simply because they're setting an example and sort of acting out of principle, saying we're going to follow this example. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is. So obviously you can set an example, but China, I think as we've seen, is very selfish. And to an extent, every nation has to protect its own interests, but we've seen that it doesn't play by the rules, right? So even if you have some kind of standards, whether even if it's like trade or intellectual property or human rights, it's been pretty clear that it doesn't play by the rules, and it doesn't really have respect for what we would consider like basic national norms. So we set an example of in a lot of things that China doesn't follow in terms of human rights. We have human rights that we have here that you wouldn't have in China, or in terms of like the sort of the persecution of Muslims that's going on there. Like you wouldn't see that in the United States. So the U.S. has an example. I think other Western countries has an example, but obviously China's not following it. So I would always like China to be better, but I don't think it will be.
Yeah, I think also not just for China, but for other countries as well. It's important. Here, we spoke a little bit about corporations. Let's talk about kind of like wealth and billionaires. Jeff Bezos is on track, I believe, to becoming the world's first trillionaire, in which he'll have more money, I think, at that point than the country of Belgium. I guess, I think it's important because, like, for example, like, let's take COVID and take this into COVID for a little bit as well. During coronavirus, I think, where is here? billionaires grew their wealth by 845 billion during the first six months of the pandemic, which is a lot of money. And I'm all for, like if like big like these businesses making money. If you have a great idea, a great product, like do your thing, make your money. But when we have people struggling to get by, struggling to pay rent, millions of people have lost their jobs. Some people are struggling with healthcare. It seems weird to kind of, and like almost paradoxical to have the top tier of people kind of like make incredible amounts of money and add to their wealth, while seeing a vast majority of Americans kind of struggle with just the most basic of needs. How do you think we can kind of deal with that?
I mean, I agree with most of what you said in the sense that the lockdown has been really destructive in terms of, the fact that, your local small businesses, your local restaurant or bar, hairdresser can't open or has to, have a takeout if they're a restaurant, or has, 50% capacity, and then, that impacts them a lot, and that is horrible for their businesses and for their livelihoods. And at the same time, you have bigger stores, let's say, I don't know, Walmart or, any other bigger chain. It's basically, operates normally. I mean, if you go inside, you probably have to wear a mask in most places, but, their businesses haven't suffered too much. And in many cases, because the small businesses have been doing worse, they've been getting more business. Like Amazon, obviously, if people are shut down at home, they're doing great. And that benefits Amazon a lot. So I'd say, yeah, the lockdown has been really destructive. And that's why I think we should try to phase it out as much as possible. And it's a kind of intervention that's been destructive, and it's since crony capitalism, where you are sort of really tilting the playing field, where basically most people are unable to function normally, but then the people who have economies of scale that have larger businesses are able to function better in that environment. I'm all for those businesses doing well, but I'm also all for normal people, sort of meaning like smaller businesses engaging in normal commerce as well.
Right.
And so to a certain extent, if you believe in the lockdown, that's kind of inevitable, right? You can't if you support closing these businesses or having these restrictions, it is inevitable that those people are going to suffer and that bigger corporations are going to thrive.
Right. We'll jump into like the COVID sphere right now. In a bit, but even outside of like a pandemic, when smaller businesses are open and things are kind of like normalized, if you will, like there's still an incredible discrepancy when it comes to wealth, and I think that, I guess it just seems weird to me that these people can accumulate so much wealth and not contribute not contribute to like society as a whole to the degree that maybe they should be.
I mean, I'd say as in their capacity as business people, they are contributing a lot, right? I mean, their wealth didn't come out of nowhere. Their wealth came because they were contributing, something very useful. And like for example, Amazon, like most of the wealth it's produced is not go directly to Jeff Bezos, but it's consumed by me and you and the products that we purchase from Amazon, right? So I mean, in terms of their personal lives, obviously, I think they have a very big. I mean, just as in a Christian understanding, they have in their personal lives, they have a very big obligation to just help the poor and to give charitably. And I don't know how much Jeff Bezos does that, or how much Mark Zuckerberg does that. I think that's that God will judge them one day for how they do that. But in terms of public policy, in terms of addressing income inequality and taxes, I'd say they contribute a lot, both in terms of what they produce, but also in terms of revenue, right? So the highest quintile of earners, so that would be the top 20%, they have 54% of the income, and they contribute 69% of the federal taxes, right? So the percentage is actually higher than other income. And then if you look at the lowest quintile, the bottom 20%, so their income is 4% of total income, and they contribute less than 1/2 of 1% in federal taxes, right? So the tax system is very progressively structured. The people at the top are contributing very disproportionately. The average tax rate for someone in the top 20% is 27%, while someone in the bottom 20%, it's less than 2%. So, it's very progressive. So in terms of maybe there's something else specifically you want to address, but in terms of are they contributing, I would say both in terms of in the capacity as business people and as taxpayers to public resources, they are contributing.
Yeah, I guess I just think that like billionaires are in a separate class almost, and the soon-to-be trillionaires are in a separate class, and they should be contributing, I guess more than they are, because because I think that it just seems paradoxical to have people in like extreme need within the country. Don't even look around the world, like just within the country itself, people struggling for, like clean water and like just basic necessities. And then meanwhile, you have like these like, giants that have, I guess, literally unfathomably large amounts of wealth. And so it just makes sense to me that they would contribute more to society because you're at a separate level. It's like you're not a millionaire. You don't have hundreds of millions. You have billions, and soon you'll have trillions. I think we fail to see really how much money that really is.
No, obviously it is a lot, and I think they should, and they, for the most part, they do contribute a lot. And in terms of, I think a lot of the times the way this is phrased is that the rich are getting poorer. Richer on the backs of the poor, and it's always possible that workers can be exploited, but in terms of family incomes for the lowest quintile have been increasing around I think like 33% in the past few decades. And once you take into account the wealth that's transferred from the rich and to the poor, which is a pretty substantial amount, it's even more. So I'm not a very libertarian person. I'm actually yeah, I would not say I'm a libertarian. So I do agree that the government has a certain obligation. No, it definitely has an obligation to help those in poor and to foster the conditions that help people get out of poverty. And to a certain extent, that does involve transfer of wealth. So some people maybe on the right are very anti-redistribution of wealth. I wouldn't say I'm that kind of person. And we do have, as I mentioned earlier, a pretty significant redistribution of resources and a progressive tax system. But more important than trying to equalize incomes is, obviously reducing poverty in the absolute sense, right? So, more important than it's better that everyone gets richer than, maybe people are poor and then more equally. So I'd say, to a certain extent, reducing massive inequality and, redistribution is important, but much, much more important, it would just be fostering the conditions that allow wages to go up and that allows economies to thrive. And I think, we've seen that in President Trump, wages have been increasing at 3%, obviously before COVID, but at 3% rate for the first time since the Great Recession, and wages were increasing a lot more than for bottom sort of the lower income levels in terms of the rate of increase than the higher ones. So, and I think that's a positive development. I think President Trump has been very good for the working class, and I think it's that's creating those kind of conditions where businesses can thrive and become more productive is more important than sort of brute redistribution or brute getting rid of inequality.
I understand. Okay, so now let's talk about kind of COVID, and we can even talk about kind of businesses under COVID. I feel like here's what I think would have been the right call in terms of COVID was to do like a hard lockdown at the beginning for like a month and then like have a better situation in the country. Other countries have done this. I think Spain did this, where they just kind of like went hard lockdown at the beginning. Obviously, they were having a lot of cases, so they just like kind of shut everything down completely for a solid period of time, and then they were able to kind of, I guess, function a little better. I think one of the problems that we had here in the U.S. was that we've been doing kind of impartial lockdowns, and it's like, well, kind of have the economy kind of closed, kind of open, and that just wasn't effective. I guess it's definitely fair to say that COVID has been politicized, unfortunately, and instead of like making the right calls, we've just been making, I guess the U.S. government has just been making political calls on both ends. So we've been kind of like going back and forth from like being semi-open, being semi-closed, and then because of it, people just get tired. All of a sudden, you're in like semi-lockdown for like 6 months, and you're just like, yo, where's the end of this? So I do think that we're just in a tough spot right now. But I think that having had that lockdown solidly at the beginning and then kind of like gone from there would have helped a lot. What do you think? Yeah,
I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the rationale behind the strategy proposes was. So I guess to repeat it would be sort of an early aggressive lockdown and then sort of more open after that instead of half and half. Well, in terms of Spain specifically, in terms of, I mean, they've had higher death rate than they've had one of the highest death rates, and to the extent but speaking more generally, it's to the extent that lockdowns work, they kind of delay the inevitable, right? So if lockdowns, it's slowing the spread now. It means that you're gonna have a spread later. And I'm looking at on my phone a graph of Spain right now, and you have basically a hump. It goes up, down, and then and then it surges back up again. So maybe their aggressive lockdown work to slow those initial cases, but they're back to almost back to the drawing board in terms of cases are going back up again. So this notion that obviously a lockdown doesn't make the virus disappear, right? I think we both agree that the rationale behind it is you don't want to have too many people getting sick at the same time because you have the hospitals and you have the resources that need to be maintained, and that's a good rationale, right? But I don't think that makes I think that's a rationale for maybe moderate restrictions and moderate lockdowns. I think a very aggressive lockdown and then opening up right away is probably the worst. I think just having some nuance is probably the best, and sort of kind of trying to keep things manageable.
Well, I guess the logic would be behind it would be more so just to limit the number of cases you get initially, and it'll give you just more time to prepare. Obviously, one of the biggest things we had was a lack of preparedness and how kind of we didn't have enough respirators to go around, and this was a big issue towards the first weeks and first months of the pandemic. It's like it'll give you more leeway, even if those cases are kind of coming in. I mean, look at this is exactly kind of what Notre Dame did. It's like we came in, we were kind of like okay. Then we had a big spike in cases. Then we restricted our social interaction and social behavior. Obviously, there was, I guess you could call that somewhat of a lockdown. And then cases went down, and we've still been getting cases. And obviously, the total number of cases go up, but at a different rate, I think. And I think that, I mean, obviously, Notre Dame's not a reflection of a country, but I do think that at the very least, it would. Again, yeah, I agree. It doesn't eliminate the virus, but I do think it definitely gives you more time, and I just think it's better to err on the side of caution when it comes. I guess what do you think that it should just be open, more nuanced? You said just kind of open and closed every now and then, or just more so open than closed?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what you said at the beginning, in terms of an early lockdown, I definitely agree is important. Just in terms of delaying things and preparedness, and the U.S. did that. Italy had the earliest lockdown, but that's part of that was partly because it was hit the earliest in terms of European countries, and it was sort of in a league of its own in terms of the severity. And then the U.S. and the rest of the European nations basically implemented their lockdowns around similar times, and in terms of severity, it was pretty equal, right? So this notion that the U.S. lockdown was much weaker than European nations is not true. In fact, not just Sweden, but other northern European countries like the Scandinavian nations were more lenient in general. So I'd say the premise that you began with, that U.S. was far more lenient, it simply does not match up with what was actually happening. And then in terms of what would be the ideal policy, I'd say having a bit of nuance, right? So we saw, for example, in New York, very hard lockdowns, and we still are seeing them where, or even in Texas, where bars and restaurants but I know bars specifically are not able to open. So I'd say ideally it would be a nuanced policy where you have, large gatherings, which by their nature, large indoor gatherings, which contribute the most to the spread. You would avoid that. And besides that, you sort of try to go about things, mostly normally, right? But you have you avoid the basic premises. You avoid the things that contribute most to the spread, right? You understand that certain activities pose more risk than others, so you avoid those things that are the highest risk, and then you sort of from there you manage things.
Okay.
So I'd say, if I were to push a strategy, would be have a baseline of no large indoor gatherings, and then things like subways or railways where there's a lot of spread. Maybe you avoid some of that as well.
Right. How do you feel we've handled it, or I guess the Trump administration has handled it?
I'd say okay. I think he, like most leaders, were too quick in terms of pushing the lockdowns or in terms of pushing the stimulus behind the lockdowns. But I wouldn't say that's necessarily a fault with him. I'd say basically the entire world, with some exceptions, has responded to this with pretty severe lockdowns, which I think was mistaken in terms of the degree of their severity. But I think we understand now that the lockdowns in general were perhaps less effective than we thought they would be, and also the consequences are just absolutely enormous in terms of the deaths from lockdowns. Like, I really wish we would count deaths from lockdowns as aggressively as we're sort of testing and counting COVID cases and COVID deaths, because I think we would really maybe reconsider the way that we're approaching this. I mean, to give you an example, the drug overdose deaths, due to stress or unemployment from the lockdowns have been skyrocketing. And in San Francisco, the increase in drug overdose deaths from last year to this year has actually been higher than the total number of people who have died from COVID. And then we're just talking about drug overdoses there, and all the other problems, like the medical problems, like people not being seen for heart attack symptoms because the resources are not being directed towards there, and heart attack units being empty because of all the resources that are being given to COVID, and also because people are afraid to come to the hospital. So you're saying you're doing this to maybe save people from COVID, but at the same time you have a lot of people dying at home from heart attacks who could have been saved in a hospital. So, and suicides as well. The young adults, 25. I think the CDC, whatever age bracket they have for young adults, the number who are seriously considered suicide, in recent months is 25%, which is pretty staggering, right? And the small increase in suicide among younger individuals would kill far more people than would die for COVID. So it's important to always look, when you're addressing policy, look at both all the ramifications of it. And I think we've seen recently the ramifications of the lockdown have been really severe.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, I think we just went over 8 million cases today as well. But I mean,
in the U.S. specifically.
Yes.
I mean, the real number is going to be like, in terms of people who actually got it, would be like 50, 60, 70 million. I mean, that's just testing, right? But it's also it's going to be many times more than we actually test, right? Just because it's a transmissible virus, and testing, it's kind of misleading, right? Because you only capture as many cases as you test,
right.
And the U.S. has definitely one of the highest testing rates in the world. And not maybe, but it does, at least compared to European nations. So you're going to discover a lot more cases in that way.
I want to ask you a little bit about kind of Donald Trump and COVID. He's, I guess you mentioned yourself, kind of downplayed a little bit the severity of COVID, and I think that
you said I downplayed it?
Donald Trump.
Oh.
Yeah.
When?
Oh.
When did I say that?
I understood that you said like him and other world leaders.
No, I'd say they were too aggressive. I said they were too aggressive in terms of pushing lockdowns. It's the exact opposite.
Okay, my bad. Well. Anyways, I do think that he downplayed them a little bit, or not a little bit, a good amount in terms of, I guess, especially like mask wearing and things like that, and saying that like that COVID will be like miraculously gone, and that it'll just be gone overnight within a month, or that and just saying that like, hey, we'll have a vaccine very soon. Essentially, I do think that his statements around COVID haven't been particularly helpful towards the situation. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say, I wouldn't say downplaying is the right word. I mean, he definitely makes loose comments that sometimes he should just not make it. So, the quote like, it would miraculously disappear that's not true, but, that's also not reflective of his entire approach to the virus. I mean, just to find a quote from like March, he said, we lose more here potentially more than we lose in world wars. So there's nothing positive, there's nothing great about it. But I want to give people in this country hope, right? So I wouldn't say that's downplaying it. So you can definitely, he makes loose comments, right? And I think everyone accepts that. And I think most people who are intellectually honest have learned to not pay too much attention to that, because they understand it's not necessarily reflective of the policy, right? So some of those comments certainly are not good, but if has the totality of his actions been downplaying it, I certainly wouldn't say that.
Okay, but you can see how like it's definitely detrimental towards the general situation, like to say like, oh, you like, I guess to like not encourage the use of masks, like for example, actively Donald Trump like I can't remember if this was in the debate or where, but like he kind of like made fun of Joe Biden for wearing too many masks all the time. I do think like mask wearing is important, and at the very worst, it's like, it's like it doesn't hurt to wear one. So, but obviously it's effective. Like that's proven. So like I think those types of things can just add on to the situation and make it worse. Yeah.
So in terms of the debate with Biden, I think one of the things he said, he was maybe I mean, I don't remember him saying Biden had too many masks on, but maybe he mentioned that Biden was wearing a mask even if he was surrounded by nobody. And obviously, if you're by yourself in that kind of situation, there's no need to wear a mask. So my position on mask wearing is basically similar to my position on COVID as a whole, which is you should target the areas that you are pose the greatest risks. And so you should wear masks, for example, definitely indoor areas, especially when there's larger capacity, because that's where it spreads the most. But there's no need to sort of have also have this sort of universality where it has to be worn everywhere. You mentioned there's no harm in wearing masks. I mean, I think most people in normal days, like if you went back like a year ago, if you gave them the choice between walking around wearing a mask or walking around without one, they would say without one, just because it's better to be without one, right? Your life is better when you have your face than when when you're walking around faceless and you're unable to see other people's faces. So it's definitely cost, and I think it's a cost that you should bear, and to a certain extent. But this notion that it's sort of inconsequential and that we should just do it, that's saying that at some points you don't necessarily have to wear. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Right. I mean, yeah, I understand. Like, I don't think you should wear a mask if you're in your car by yourself.
Yeah.
But I do think that, like, I don't know. I just think his comments around COVID, and I do think that he's downplayed the virus. Again, I feel like saying that, like, his comments, for example, that saying it's like it'll miraculously be gone. It's like loose comments. It's kind of an optimistic view of it because that has like ramifications.
I don't think it's optimistic. I think it's realistic in the sense it is loose and it's not reflective of the overall attitude towards the right. I mean, he said repeatedly that let's say 2 million. He said repeatedly 2 million people would have died if we didn't do anything. And I don't know if 2 million people would have died. I mean, that's kind of a hard thing to predict. I mean, there were some models that were saying that, but you can't say that a person who goes around saying that has been downplaying it because you find some comment where he says it's going to disappear, where that's simply not true, and I don't think that would affect the public too much.
Right. Okay. Well, I disagree. But we have more topics to cover, so let's get to those. Let's talk about the Supreme Court, and I think that there's a lot to talk about here with regards to I think there's an issue with accountability amongst both parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, and how obviously you're going to wage for your side and you're just going to, say something whenever it's convenient. But I do think that, I don't know, it seems like there's just no integrity anymore. Obviously, a lot of videos of Republican candidates have resurfaced from 4 years ago when we were having a similar situation, and Lindsey Graham, I believe, famously said, "I want you to use my words against me," and now he's saying it's a totally different context. I'm not saying there isn't that same hypocrisy in the Democratic Party. I think there is. I think it exists on both sides, but I guess where does that is that just what it is, and we shouldn't improve, right? Because I guess my point is I see a room for improvement here. And I think that we should set a precedent as to words meaning something, and when a politician says something, it should have weight to it. So and obviously it's not the case anymore. So I guess how do you feel about that? How do you feel about Republican candidates or politicians kind of going back on their words so heavily even?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what's when you're talking about improving, what specifically are we improving?
Well, I think that, for example, for one, just giving meaning to words. Just if you say something and you literally say, "Hey, this is what I believe," and hold me accountable to my word, and then when people hold you accountable to your word, you're just like, "Nah," and that's bad objectively on both parties. I don't think that. I don't think it's good for words to mean nothing, particularly in politics, even though I guess that's the political climate we live in now. But I just think this was a great opportunity for the Republican Party to just say, hey, we did say this at the time, we stick to it right now, and that's what we believe.
Yeah, I mean, hypocrisy is always a bad thing. So, I would love if our politicians were stuck to their word, and I think you would as well. And I think, to a certain extent, we've maybe unfortunately come to accept that, politics is a dirty business. In terms of like comparing this confirmation to the last confirmation, I mean, there's obviously the big differences. Here both presidency and the Senate are in the control of one party, right? In the last confirmation, in Obama, he had every right to appoint a judge, and the Senate had every right to decide whether or not they're going to confirm him. In the same case as here, right? So the only thing that matters when you're appointing a judge ultimately is the Constitution, and what that requires is just a presidency and the Senate. And I think if Democrats had the Senate during Obama's time, they certainly would have moved ahead with a confirmation. And if they had the Senate today, I think they certainly would have tried to block President Trump's nominee. So I mean, obviously that's for most part that's just politics, and that's different sides trying to pursue their own goals.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I guess my point is like, so it's okay to like, are we just being complacent? Then it's okay to be complacent and say, hey, I guess whatever. Like we did, like our candidates did say this, and it's fine. Like it doesn't matter. That's what politics is.
No, I think it is what politics is, but I don't think that's necessarily being complacent in the sense that I recognize that's a bad thing, right? That's a bad aspect of politics. I recognize that there are certain things about politics that are bad and that we should improve. And I think, obviously President Trump was not there when the confirmation for Obama's appointee was going on. So just like Obama had, his ability, just like Obama chose to make an appointment towards the end of its term, President Trump chose to appoint one now, and both had the same prerogative to do so, and both are subject to the same restrictions from whatever the Senate decides.
So, do you think then that what should the president be then? I think right now we're less than 20 days away from the election, and we're setting this president essentially that like, well, I guess I don't know I guess we're not setting a president because we would be if there was an agreement between statements that were made in the past and now. I guess right now it's essentially whatever's convenient. Like, what should the president be, or do you think it's just things should just continue? I guess should there be a president, or should things just continue to just be like whenever it's convenient? It's like just like don't. It doesn't matter what your words say or what words you use.
Yeah, I mean, I think the precedent should be what's the Constitution permits, which is that if you want to confirm a justice, these are the two things you need. And in terms of the past, I haven't studied this too closely, but I believe in basically most cases where both parties have had control of the White House and the Senate, towards the end of the term, they've moved forward with a confirmation, and I'd say so that would be a precedent, right? And that wasn't done intentionally. That's just part of the understanding that they have the ability, they have the prerogative to appoint a nominee, and if they are able to do so, they can, right? And I think trying to be more specific, trying to put a standard that's extra constitutional, I don't think that's feasible, and I don't think that's necessary, right? You have elections to decide who is in power, and once those people are in power, they're free to exercise whatever prerogatives they have to try to implement whatever agenda they have.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might sound cynical, but that's simply what the purpose of politics is to sort of implement policies when you have authority, and trying to have some extra constitutional standard to regulate that, I don't think is feasible or necessary.
Right. So Charlie, is he your VP?
Yeah. No, Charlie. No, he's not.
Is he?
He's just a club member.
Okay. So Charlie, who was also speaking in the debate, I think he mentioned that like he thought that would happen. Under President Obama and with the whole like justice situation as well was, I guess, not a good thing, and he expressed negative feelings about it. Would you agree with him then? And it should just be then the president should be, just if you're in power, like you should be able to appoint a judge even like on your last day.
Yeah, I mean that you should be. It's not should you be able to. You are able to, right? Because you're the president.
Well, but I mean, President Obama wasn't able to do that.
No, I mean he appointed one. It just wasn't confirmed.
Right. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So but so then that was wrong.
What was wrong? I mean,
it was wrong that it wasn't confirmed.
I wouldn't say that's wrong. I think it's just like the president can appoint or not appoint a judge based on his power. The Senate has the ability to exercise its power to confirm, and to say that it's always better for the Senate to confirm than not confirm is simply not true. Otherwise there would be no point in giving them that power. The reason the Constitution gives them that power is to have a check with where there's two parties who can both make their own judgments, and to say that it's better to confirm than not confirm, I wouldn't say it's the case.
Well, the judge wasn't confirmed for obvious political reasons.
Yeah.
Not anything having to do with qualifications.
Well, I think it's not. I guess it depends what you think of as political. If you see that there's a judge,
just the fact that the Senate was a Republican Senate majority, and not the fact that does that make sense? If it should be appointed based on qualifications, and those qualifications should be just based on whoever's in power. At the time, President Obama was in office, and the Senate was Republican, was a majority Republican Senate, and they shot down, or they didn't approve that nominee because he was appointed by Obama, not because of who he was or what his qualifications were.
Well, I say just like it's not necessarily political when Obama nominates someone, it's not necessarily
right,
political.
but the motive behind why it's the Senate does have it completely in its right to approve or disapprove of a nominee, but it should be based on nonpartisan ideas and just I guess the interpretation of the law.
Sure,
that wasn't the case though.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I think it should be done based on legal theory, and some people might consider that a political thing. Obviously, I mean the different parties have differences with respect to what a judge should do and how they should approach the law. So, and that should be a consideration. Now, what was the context of what the Republicans did in 2016? I don't know because I wasn't following politics that closely. So, if it was purely political in the sense that there was no arguments that he was a good or a bad judge, then that's good. That's bad. Sorry, that's not a way you should approach a confirmation. But if they were doing it because that they didn't think he was going to be a good judge because of the way he approaches the law, I think that's a reasonable way.
Yeah, I do think it is. I mean, I personally think that because unfortunately it is a very partisan thing now, appointing Supreme Court judges. I do think that if you're this close to the election, you should just wait. And I'm not just saying that out of convenience. I just mean it because of something like what happened under President Obama's presidency could happen. And I think, unfortunately, we've come to that point where I guess it's all a battle for my whatever I want and whatever, the Senate clearly at the time prioritized, I guess, having a nominee from their side instead of just picking somebody based on their qualifications. And I think that shows based on the hypocrisy in their statements that was shown. I'm not saying the Democrats would not have done that. I actually believe that they likely would have. And I think that's an unfortunate thing in politics. And I don't think that's why I think that if we're this close to an election, we should just wait. But I can be on board with the idea that just exercise your right as the president to nominate somebody, as long as the Senate exercise their right in a just manner based on qualifications. I just don't think that happens.
I think we definitely agree that it's been overly politicized, and I think both parties are responsible for that. Basically the game has become each side. Basically, all the power has gone to the Supreme Court to basically decide any questions, and each side wants their guy on the court, right? And that makes it always political. Not even if it's not close to an election day. That makes the process political, and I would like to move away from that by not giving so much power to the Supreme Court, and that's a structural issue that we should definitely fix, and that's actually an issue I'm very passionate about.
Right, I understand.
It shouldn't matter, to put it another way, it shouldn't matter so much who sits on the Supreme Court, because they shouldn't be able to decide all the fundamental issues of, let's say, marriage or abortion or, immigration policy. Those belong to the political branches of government. And, unfortunately, the reason it's politicized is not necessarily, the hypocrisy has part to do with it, but that's inevitably going to happen if you politicize it, and which is the consequence of the way both sides approach the Constitution and the judiciary.
I understand. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the United States position in the world and I guess foreign policy to some degree. I don't have anything particularly other than the fact that I do think that Trump's presidency has put the U.S. has given the United States as a country a bad reputation across the world with other world leaders and with other world governments. I think that like things like, for example, pulling out of the Paris Accords and the Iran nuclear deal, and just I think the United States does have a historic. I would say that under the Trump presidency, this has definitely been accentuated, but definitely it has had a historic kind of track record of undermining kind of international institutions in the sense of like they just don't like to be a part of them. I do think they should participate more, and like pulling out of these deals was not a good idea. I do feel like it's putting up boundaries and blocks between us and our allies. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think the way you judge foreign policy and different agreements or institutions should be on the merits of those policies specifically, right? So whether you think this, let's say NATO is a good or bad thing, or I guess maybe a better example would be Iran nuclear deal. It shouldn't be based on do your allies want you to do it, or how is this going to impact how they see you. It should be based on, is this a good policy or is this a bad policy? Because obviously different nations have different interests, and you don't want to be led into a bad policy, because, simply sort of to have sort of a facade of, we're working together, right?
Right, yeah. I would agree with that if it wasn't for the fact that, like, I think that the United States definitely has this image and this desire to be like the world police and kind of like, hey, we're in Japan, we're in Europe, we are defending our allies, and if these countries were completely militarily self-sustainable, if Japan could fend off China by themselves, if Europe could fend off Russia by themselves, I'm game. But that's not the case, and I think that that's why it's important in that sense.
Yeah, in terms of being a world police, I think I think maybe a lot of people on the right and on the left agree that the U.S. overall is too heavily involved in different areas, and I think that's been kind of a feature of President Trump, is since he was sort of championed as being a very anti-war candidate, and not just in the Middle East, but generally he's more sort of not necessarily isolationist, but more restrained. So I in terms of being less of the world's police than we need to be, I think I'm for that. I think you should do what's necessary at a base level for national security and not try to go too far beyond that.
Right. Yeah, I do think we have to be careful on the way out, though. Of certain places. I guess a good example of it was what happened in the Middle East with Kurdistan, I believe it was. Like we pulled up and some of our allies in the region were kind of like left to their own avail, and they're kind of struggling right now. And I think it's important to take care of your allies, I think, is ultimately my point, and to have good relationships with other countries, and to be seen in a positive and what the U.S. should be is essentially like a pinnacle of like freedom and liberty and justice and democracy.
It's definitely always important to work with allies to the extent that you have common interests. So right. Yeah, that's true.
All right. So let's talk about, then circling all the way back to, I guess let's talk a little bit about the election. Trump has made some interesting statements on his debates, but also just outside of, on his debate, the one and only, and outside of that debate as well, about this election being rigged, him feeling like there won't be a transfer of power. Do these comments concern you at all?
Some, yeah. Can you elaborate on the transfer of power comment? Because I'm not.
So people, like, he's been asked, like, if you lose, like, will there be a peaceful transfer of power? And he just said, well, there won't be a transfer of power.
Yeah, I mean, if he said that, then obviously that's a bad thing to say. I mean, do I worry that there won't be a transfer of power? No, I don't think so.
Right.
I don't see that in him, and I don't think that would even be feasible, even if he attempted. I think we saw a peaceful, but we also a corrupt transfer of power from the previous presidency to this one in terms of the way the different surveillance powers were being abused. But obviously, if he's he should definitely be clear that I will transfer power as Constitution obligates me.
Right. I also think that it can be dangerous because I agree with you that I don't think a coup could be established. I mean, you never, it's always impossible until it happens. On one end, but on the other, I have faith in the American, system, and I think that I do think though that like some people could be motivated by certain comments like these and I don't know, potentially like cause some real damage.
I mean, maybe. I mean, there's always a possibility that someone will take a comment and use it to justify something bad. So, which is why again, if he said what you were mentioned earlier, that
Right.
you should definitely clarify that or change the statement, or yeah. I mean,
Right.
I don't think there's necessarily anything we disagree with there.
Do you feel like this election is rigged?
Rigged? No, I'm not in the sense that there's some kind of big plot. I mean, in terms of the last election, we learned mostly after the fact that there were definitely certain abuses that were going on during the election. Again, in terms of like the surveillance powers. So I mean, obviously that was Obama was in power at that time. So Trump's in power now. So obviously, we will, there's not those same kind of risk for those kind of problems to occur.
That's okay. That's interesting. How do you feel about Russia and their like involvement in American elections?
I mean, in terms of the WikiLeaks, that's a bad thing to do, hacking the Democrat National Committee's server, and showing those emails. That was certainly bad. Assuming that they did it, which based on intelligence reports, it looks like they probably did do it. Although the server that FBI requested was not transferred over to the FBI, which is rather strange. It was just analyzed by third party. So I'll definitely take their word for it that. The hacking and obviously the hacking happened, and I'll take the intelligence reports that it was. I trust the intelligence reports that it was done by Russia, and obviously counterintelligence is something that a game that you're always playing, right? And it's most of it goes on behind the scenes, and I'm sure they're engaging in those kind of things now, and it just happened to become public in 2016 and kind of caused a splash.
So do Trump's I guess does his proximity to like world leaders like Putin and like Kim Jong-un concern you at all?
Proximity, like
he seems very comfortable with them and to maybe appreciate certain qualities of them that I wouldn't consider very democratic, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, he's maybe more unorthodox in the sense that he tries to cultivate, more personal relationship with people, and then see if he can work with that in terms of try to accomplish American interests from there. So sometimes that would mean that he says things or that that aren't great or the optics aren't good. But overall, in terms of being authoritarian, that's obviously not a feature of President Trump. People say that he's been authoritarian when in reality, most of what he's done, basically all has been well in line with the law or the Constitution. So if you're gonna judge a president, I think in that way it's best to sort of point to specific examples. This was an all unlawful move, or that was an unlawful move. But he's been pretty well guided by.
I do think there's just like a weird pattern of it's like, for example, that proximity, but also like comments like saying there won't be a transfer of power. It's just like it kind of paints a picture, and you can see why people kind of put those together.
Yeah, maybe it definitely doesn't look great. I mean, in terms of Putin specifically, I think strategically the U.S. has been pretty good with Russia in terms of for one thing, trying to, in terms of energy development and natural gas production, that's really put the U.S. on great footing, not just in the Middle East, but the rest of the world, in the sense that they have great leverage in terms of natural gas production and sort of leverage with Europe, and sort of sanctioning people who are working on Russian pipelines into Europe has been big, and combine that with sort of energy sales to Europe, that's definitely put Russia on sort of the back foot. So in terms of policy-wise, I think the way we've approached Russia has been decent.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about his unorthodoxy. Do you feel like Trump has changed the Republican Party at all, or do you think the Republican Party is more so showing its true colors?
I think he's definitely changed it. I think especially on immigration is a big one. I think before that, part of the reason why he was elected is because there was a lot of frustration from working class people over the failure of both parties to secure the border. I mean, we had, obviously Ronald Reagan made an amnesty, then we had another attempt by George Bush and John McCain in 2006, and then 2013 you had the Gang of Eight, amnesty proposal. So, Republicans really were kind of for a large part, take away people like Jeff Sessions, it's kind of an amnesty party, and I think voters were kind of frustrated with the establishment and the status quo, and I think Trump was definitely a big signal that, the voters are going to hold the politicians accountable, and if they don't get done what the voters want, then someone new is going to be put in office. And in terms of foreign policy as well, obviously Trump and sort of George Bush are on kind of different sides of, how involved you should be, especially in the Middle East. So I think Trump has definitely pulled the Republican Party in terms of being more sort of restraint, although I'd say there's still a pretty significant, part of the party that wants sort of more interventionism, and that's always going to be there. But generally, I wouldn't say he's changed it too much in the sense that even though maybe people might consider him unorthodox, he's basically embraced what would be considered sort of standard Republican politicians or values since Reagan or before, in the sense of more free markets on taxes, or just judges that are following the Constitution more closely, or being pro-life, or sort of greater defense budgets. These are all standard Republican policies that have defined our party going back, not just to Reagan but to Barry Goldwater. So I mean, he's pretty well in line in what would be considered normal Republican policies.
Okay, do you feel like these changes have been for the better or for the worse?
On immigration, definitely for the better. Obviously, that's an issue I care about. And then on other issues, I wouldn't say hasn't been too much change.
Right. So I have a brief excerpt because I do feel like Trump has definitely changed the Republican Party, in my opinion, for the worse. In the sense that I wouldn't even consider Trump to be a Republican in many of the ways that he appears to think. I have this excerpt from Ronald Reagan's kind of closing statement before leaving office. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's his "Shining City Upon a Hill" kind of like portion of his speech. Let me just mute this so you guys don't have to hear that ad. But essentially, I just kind of want to play it and then just kind of see the difference between kind of that and now. And I feel like this image is more so, obviously it's, this Reagan left office in 89. But I do feel like this gives me more of an image of what I saw the Republican Party, or what I feel like it should be, as opposed to now. You'll see the difference, but let me just play this. Okay, here it is. No. Oh, okay. Sorry, I forgot to turn on the. What? Okay, I'm sorry. I forgot to turn on the console here. All right.
And that's about all I have to say tonight, except for one thing. The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. And how stands the city on this winter night? More prosperous, more secure, and happier than it was 8 years ago.
All right, so that's kind of the clip I wanted to play. But essentially, I thought that it just paints a very different picture than a lot of Trump's statements today, not just in content, but also in tone. It seems a lot more presidential. This is what I kind of picture the Republican Party. I feel like that's just a better representation of it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's too much of a difference between Trump and Reagan. I think Make America Great Again has much of the sort of the tones and the appeals that the shining city upon a hill has, in the sense that, do you believe that this is something that's, worth preserving, and this is something that's wonderful and that we should enjoy? So, maybe in terms of like tone, I mean, there's definitely a difference in the sense that Trump is just not as eloquent as Reagan. And, obviously it's of course nice if a president can make good speeches and good deliveries. Of course, I primarily judge Trump just based on how he governs. And I've sort of learned to move past maybe different rhetoric that might annoy me. But in terms of the way they see America overall, I wouldn't say it's too different. Is there anything specific? Like, how would you describe the way Trump sees America versus Reagan?
I guess the fact that, for example, the Build a Wall slogan, Reagan mentioned in this excerpt, he said, it's a city, and if the city has to have walls, the walls will have doors on them, that I guess it's just a lot more welcoming. It's a lot less divisive. I feel it definitely. You listen to this and it's like, well, I can disagree with your opinions and your policy, but you're at least being respectful and you're a reasonable person, as opposed to just calling, for example, people from the southern, like they come from the southern border, rapists. I think it's two very different things, and I don't say that in a vacuum, right? It's his comments, for example, on John McCain. It's his comments on like not taking natural disasters seriously, throwing paper towels. Like it's not just one thing, and I feel like it's easy to. I have a hard time sometimes expressing to some of my conservative friends that, hey, I don't have a problem with the Republican Party. I don't think one side has all the answers. That's why there's two of them. I think we should work together and find middle ground on things, and I think there's important things to consider on both sides. But I don't think Donald Trump is a good representation of what a Republican is or what a Republican should be. I don't know if it concerns me a little bit the direction that the Republican Party could be going if it continues this way. I'm not too concerned because I feel like a lot of Republicans that I know agree with me. There's large movements. For example, there's the Republicans Against Trump movement that has obviously his supporters, some supporters of the Republican Party against him, and then there's also even politicians that have expressed that they dislike the president or how he behaves, or just simply have expressed outright that they won't be voting for him. Cindy McCain, who is the widow of Senator John McCain, won't express that she won't be voting for Trump, and then you also have people that have expressed. I mean, there's a long list. I just won't read them because they're not all, I guess, major figures. But former President George W. Bush has expressed that he does not. Well, he didn't endorse him in 2016, and he doesn't endorse him now. Senator Mitt Romney has also been critical of Trump. John Bolton. So I just feel like there's relevant figures in the Republican Party that seem to agree with this notion that I kind of have, that this isn't Trump's presidency shouldn't be representative of what Republicans stand for, and shouldn't be representative of how Republicans stand for things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think generally. So I mean, there was a lot you brought up, so I'm not quite sure where to begin. But in terms of like people disliking how he behaves, I mean that's certainly a reasonable position to have, and I don't always like how he behaves. And then in terms of like some of the personal feuds he's had, I think those certainly exist, especially with people like John McCain. Although I think there's blame on both sides, and like I mentioned earlier, he's most generally not the first one to throw the punch. But I don't think, in terms of, it's important to distinguish how he sees America from how he necessarily acts generally, or how he might say things, right? So I wouldn't say that it's how he what he might say in some of his comments necessarily means that he views the country in a certain way that's not negative. And I wouldn't say he's very distanced from conservative ideas generally. I'd say he's more in line with conservative ideas, or at least what I understand as being a conservative, than many of the people who are critical of him. I think a lot of the people who are critical of him simply don't hold conservative policy goals in high esteem, and I think the fact that they're willing to put their dislike of what he might say or what he might do above what they're trying to accomplish as conservatives seems to suggest that they are not as committed to conservative causes as we thought initially.
I would disagree, because I feel like it kind of shows a commitment to what they believe the Republican Party to be. Obviously, we've established that Donald Trump is kind of unorthodox and definitely has a particular way of going about things. And I understand your point, but I do feel like it's gained enough traction, this movement, and like these notable figures. I feel like it speaks a lot to kind of like where the Republican Party stands today. I know it's like a difficult position for a Republican. I mean, one of my closest friends here is a conservative person, very conservative, and he and he's also a Republican, but he understands that this is an exception. Donald Trump is not representative of of what Republicans are, and he, that doesn't take away from the Republican Party. It depends on whether, if you're of that mindset, like I am, I think that it depends on whether or not you believe that you can recover or not. I know it's like obviously you as the president of the College Republicans, it's it's a tough spot to be in. But I guess my last question for you would be like, do you think the Republican Party should continue in this direction, or do you think it can do better and it should do better?
Yeah, maybe later you could clarify what you mean by what this direction is, because you said Trump's unorthodox, and in some ways he is unorthodox, but in many other ways in many other ways he's not unorthodox, but he's actually pretty orthodox in terms of pushing standard conservative policies, and oftentimes better than more effectively than other conservatives. I think the Heritage Foundation, like 2 years ago, came out with a report, and the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank, and they basically found in Trump's first year and a half, he accomplished more of what they listed as their policy priorities than Ronald Reagan did in that same time span. So in terms of what the direction of the Republican Party is, I'd say it's largely, I'd say the direction is good in the sense that it's largely conservative ideas with a greater emphasis maybe on immigration and also China. I think he's actually put a Republican Party in a better direction in the sense he's recognized sort of that the way they've taken advantage of us and the way they need necessarily compete, the way we need to be stronger in competing with them. And I'd say those are ways he's pushed the party in a good direction. Now, overall, if people who know me politically will know that I'm probably one of the most critical people of the Republican Party generally, because I don't see them as necessarily a conservative party. I think most Republicans are kind of centrist or even to the left. So I'd say, but that's not necessarily a criticism of President Trump as a whole, as it is the Republican Party as a whole. I wouldn't say either party in this country necessarily reflects my political values very well at all. And, I just support the Republican Party simply because it's closer to me than the Democrats, but I still have plenty of problems with them.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting, because I definitely do consider the Republican Party to be on the right, at least, a good amount. And especially under Trump's presidency, I feel like it's gone, a good amount in that direction as well. But I guess what I meant in terms of that direction initially, not just now, is I guess should the Republican Party be, you use the word unorthodox, should it be becoming more unorthodox, or should it be, I guess, more normal? Yeah,
I can't definitively answer that question because orthodoxy or unorthodoxy can be good or bad things, right? In certain ways, what people would call the establishment is good. In certain ways, it's bad. So, obviously, as there's different presidents or different Republican leaders, it's gonna be different simply because they have different styles, and that's natural. Right? Not every Republican today or tomorrow will have the same style as President Trump, and that's that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. But I wouldn't say he's necessarily put the party on a footing that's bad. I'd say more good than bad, in fact.
All right. Well, that's good, man. That's all the questions I have. This is probably my longest episode yet, so thank you for bearing with me here.
Oh, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for being. Fun. Yeah, it was super fun. It was very insightful. I learned a lot. I feel like it's I think it's important to kind of put these perspectives out there and also have these conversations. So I definitely appreciate you coming on.
No, yeah, it was great to be on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate it. All right, everyone. I think that's our show for today. Sorry for this extra long episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Definitely tune in to our next episode and check out our previous ones. I have no clue who I have next on the list yet. I think I don't have anyone for next week, but we will find that out. Anyways, thank you guys very much for tuning in. Have a great day or night or whatever. And I'm out. Peace out.